Good morning. They say you can tell you're at a Catholic meeting by two things. There's no one in the front pew, and that's not true, and the audio visuals never work, and I'm just stunned. It's a new day. I am deeply honored to be here for this remarkable gathering, and it was given this topic, and it made me very anxious. Yesterday, you look back at Pope Francis and where he comes from. Ross shared some of his hopes and concerns about what's going on, and I've been asked to look ahead to what might happen this fall. But I want to begin by looking back as well. Some of us in the room can remember in 1960 where major figures in American life, Norman Vincent Peale, Dr. Billy Graham, Martin Luther King Sr., said that John Kennedy should not be elected president because he would take advice from the Pope. And on September 23rd, it appears that the only thing Democrats and Republicans can agree on is they need advice from the Pope. This is going to be an extraordinary thing. You have behind, this is the extent of my Photoshop abilities. I'm really quite proud of it. You have two Catholics, very different Catholics. The closest Washington gets to liturgy is a joint session of Congress. You have an entrance procession, people stand and sit and clap and cheer, and it's a very elaborate ritual. Well, no one knows what the ritual is going to be. When does Biden stand? When does Boehner stand? It's going to be fun to watch. I wouldn't miss it. So I'm going to try and think ahead to what might happen there and some things about the larger visit. But before I do that, I want to repeat my appreciation for being here. What the Institute does, the mission is outstanding. Tom has become a great friend. What the initiative does is try to help lay Catholics, young men and women, and all of us, appreciate Catholic social thought and bring that tradition into public life and economic life. And Tom and his family, I met his brother Joe. If Portsmouth had anything to do with the contributions they're making, you are doing the right thing, and I'm proud to be here and be a part of it, a small part. I want to express appreciation to Chris for putting together this wonderful program and for including me. I also want to thank him and Father Landry for a very personal thing. Some of you may remember that the media editor of the New York Times, media columnist of the New York Times, collapsed and died in the Times newsroom. That was my brother, David Carr. And David had an extraordinary life. He was not your typical Times columnist. He went from being a crack addict to a wonderful father, great Catholic, and journalist. And tomorrow morning, we're having a memorial back home in Minnesota for him, and his family will be there. And I was very anxious to get there, and I called Chris, and he called Father Landry, and we were able to rearrange things. So I'm deeply grateful for that. And then I just want to say something about Cardinal Sean O'Malley. Cardinal O'Malley is the only cardinal I've ever fired. You're supposed to laugh at that. When he and I both worked for Cardinal Hickey, Father O'Malley had two jobs. He was head of Hispanic ministry and social ministry, and I was hired by Cardinal Hickey, a wonderful leader, to sort of reorganize things. And Father O'Malley's tremendous gifts in the Hispanic community were so obvious. They said, let's get him working on that full time and we'll find somebody else to do this other stuff. So I was in my 30s at the time. I sat down and I said, Father O'Malley, we want to focus your energies in one of the most important things in the church's life. and therefore we're going to let someone else do this. And he looked at me and said, "You're firing me." And I said, "No, we're focusing your energies." Well, if I had known that he was going to be Cardinal Archbishop of Boston and one of the principal advisors to the Pope, I would have put it a different way. He is one of the people I most admire in the world, and I think he's demonstrated that he can do more than one job and do it really well. So I'm honored to be here for this topic, this purpose, with these people, but I'm anxious. I know how open New Englanders are to other perspectives. I'm from the Midwest and I work in Washington. I feel very much like an outsider. I feel a little bit like the story I often tell of a priest who was invited to give a guest homily on an important occasion for the church. And he prepared well and thought it had gone well. And he and the pastor stood at the back of the church after Mass. And most folks were very gracious, very kind, very complimentary. But at the very end of the line, a gentleman got up, reached out his hand, and he said, "You talk way too fast. You really had very little to say. And it wasn't very helpful." Well, obviously the preacher was concerned about this. And he turned to the pastor and he said, "Who is this guy? And what is his problem?" And the pastor said, "Oh, don't worry about him. He just goes around repeating what everybody else is saying." So, I know I will talk too fast. I hope I have something to say, but I'm not standing in the back with Chris when this is over. Despite my outsider status, I think I'm here for several reasons. I bring a couple perspectives. One is my work at Georgetown now. To be very honest, my academic career is new. The only thing I knew about Jesuit higher education was that I paid for it. And my experience with how the Jesuits practice the option for the poor is by making me poor. But I'm learning. The other perspective, and this has been a fabulous experience, less than 2 years old. We literally have had thousands of people come out. We actually had a panel with the President of the United States, the head of a conservative think tank, and a Harvard professor on how we might work together across party lines to lift up the poor. Working with young people in Washington, it's just been great, fabulous. But part of, and Tom references, I spent more than 20 years working for the Catholic Bishops' Conference. And it was a wonderful way to see the strength and vitality of our church's social mission, not only in this country but around the world. People standing up for human life and dignity in a way that makes you proud to be a part of this family of faith. But it wasn't always easy. I served during the worst of the sexual abuse crisis, and I was a parent of teenage boys. The bishops, I really admire them and their work. They're not the happiest people on earth, be fair to say. When limbo went into limbo, I said to one of the bishops, "I never really understood limbo. I do not feel badly about its apparent demise, but don't mess with purgatory, because working for you has to count." It was a great job, but I had the most pompous title in Washington. How would you like to be in charge of justice, peace, and human development? I was on an elevator with a woman, and I was introduced by this pompous title, and she looked at me and said, "You need to do a better job." Well, true. We all do, and that's part of what brings us together this weekend. I'm going to talk about public life. I'm going to talk about what the Holy Father might tell Congress. I should tell you about my own political perspectives. I'm a product of a mixed marriage. Both my parents are Minnesota Catholics. My mother is from St. Paul, my dad from Minneapolis. Some of you know that's a big deal. Of significance, my mother's family, committed Republicans. My uncle was the Republican leader of the Minnesota Senate. My dad's family, diehard Democrats. My grandfather was Hubert Humphrey's finance chairman when he ran for mayor. For the younger people in the room, Hubert Humphrey was vice president of the United States at one point. So I learned at an early age that we can express our faith and our values in a different way. But the most significant perspective I bring here is more personal. A believer, a Catholic, a parishioner. My wife was president of the parish council in our little parish, about as close as you get to purgatory in this life. We've raised 4 children together, 2 boys, 2 girls. The hardest thing I have ever done is not helping the bishops respond to the Iraq war or deal with religious freedom issues. It's been trying to raise kids with Christian values in this culture. And one of the most powerful things the Pope said in his encyclical of a couple days ago is, what kind of a world are we going to leave our children? I now have grandchildren, our grandchildren as well. That is true of the environment, but that's also true much more broadly. What kind of world, what kind of church, what kind of country are we going to leave our children? So here's what I'm going to try and do in the next 45 minutes. Talk about the Francis factor. What does it mean to have this Pope come to the United States at this time? Say just a little bit about the journey, what he's going to do. Talk for a second about the mission, as I understand it, and then talk about the message, what he might say based on what he's said and done so far. I've been asked to say a word about the new encyclical, and if time permits, I'll give you perspective on that, and then close with our challenge. It's really important to remember, at least for me, what a surprise Pope Francis was. I think he was 141st in the betting line over in Ireland. If we had put a few bucks down, we could have paid for the whole initiative. Tom mentioned that I was a fellow at Harvard. I didn't know what a fellow did. When we told our kids that I was a fellow at Harvard, my son Tim said, "Are we talking the real Harvard?" But it turns out what a fellow does, Tom, don't repeat this, is you eat and you talk. And as you can see, I know how to eat, and as you'll learn, I like to talk. So I was a perfect fellow. But they brought me back after Francis was elected for a panel on the Pope. And it was a somewhat typical academic panel in that they basically suggested they knew it all along. You know, it was time for Latin and this and that. I said, wait a minute. I said, when I left here a few months ago, if I had called a publisher and said, here is my book, the Pope resigns, says, I can't do this anymore. That's chapter 1. Chapter 2, we follow an old Jesuit on a bus in Argentina. Chapter 3, the old Jesuit on the bus gets elected Pope. And he doesn't move into the Apostolic Palace, and as Cardinal O'Malley said last night, he spends Holy Thursday in a prison. And what do you think they'd tell me to do with my book? Well, it's quite a story, and I can't wait to see how it turns out. We're watching that unfold. Some people say that where the Pope lives, how he says Mass, what he wears, where he stands, who he spends his time with, are not important. I disagree. In a sacramental church, symbols are tremendously important in communicating, and the symbolism of his time in the United States would be very powerful. A progressive friend of mine, no friend of the church, said, this is all made up. You know, this is a charade. You know, he's got all these handlers. I said, name one leader who stands in front of the press corps for 90 minutes on his way home after 4 exhausting days and takes all their questions. He said this is a big PR strategy. I said name the last successful Vatican PR strategy. Actually, I think they did quite a good job with the environmental encyclical. But before that, I think it was pre-Crusades. At one of our panels, Michael Gerson said, as an evangelical, he says, I think your new pope is a troublemaker. And he said, there's nothing more dangerous than a troublemaker with a plan. And I asked Ross Douthat, who was here, at a subsequent thing, whether the pope was a troublemaker. And he responded, he's really smart, he said, of course he is, he's a Christian. So that's part of the Francis factor. I think you go back to the first moment, and I apologize, I'm violating every rule about PowerPoint. Too many slides, too many words, all that, I get it. I think it's more important that we focus on what Francis said than what I have said. So, and you know the story, it's apparently a sin to tell what goes on in a conclave. So what does the new pope do but call a press conference to say what went on at the conclave? And he said, well, these are his words, when things were looking dangerous, meaning when the votes were mounting up, his best friend leaned over, gave him a hug, gave him a kiss, and said, don't forget about the poor. He said, and that's when I decided I will call myself Francis, a man of the poor, a man of creation, and a man of peace. So I think when he comes to the United States, he comes as Francis, a man of the poor, a man of creation, a man of peace. My other favorite story from the beginning of his leadership in the Swiss Guard, apparently he went back to the same room he was staying in, and when he got up for Mass, the Holy Father walked out, and there was this Swiss Guard standing there at attention. And the Holy Father said to him, what are you doing? And he said, well, I'm protecting you. He said, well, when did you start protecting me? And he said, at midnight. It's about 5 a.m. He said, so you've been standing there since midnight? And he said, yes. And so he went into his room, and he brought out a chair, and he said, have a seat. And the guard tells the story. He says, I can't. I'm on duty. He says, who says you can't sit down? He says, my commandant. He said, haven't you heard? I'm the Pope. He said, have you had anything to eat? He said, no, I'm on duty. Goes in, makes him a sandwich, brings it out. He says, bon appetit. He says, I can't eat on duty. He says, you're not listening. I'm the Pope. Bon appetit. I think you can tell a leader by how they treat the people around them, not just the rich and famous, but the people who protect them. So let's talk about the visit. First of all, it's really short. This is an elderly man with one lung. It's going to be really busy. Of all things, he's coming from Cuba. Who would have said that when the next Pope visits the United States, he'll come through Havana? But he comes to Washington. He's going to be at the White House. He's going to talk to the Congress. There's going to be a mass at the National Shrine. He leaves for New York. One of the official reasons is he's going to talk to the UN General Assembly. And then he goes to the World Conference on Families, which in many ways is the anchor of the visit, and then returns. There are several firsts, as Tom said. No Pope has ever addressed a joint session of Congress. Everyone's very excited about that. I say be careful what you wish for. I think the Holy Father, being who he is and believing what he believes, is likely to create moments of great affirmation and great discomfort, and both are deserved. One of the most significant things about the visit is this will be Pope Francis' first time he sets foot in the United States. Imagine, what other world leader of this stature has never been here? So he will be meeting us, and we'll be meeting him. And I already made the comment on Cuba. One of the things that I most appreciate about Pope Francis is his humility. And so early on, and there are people in the room who know these facts better than I do, the crowd was chanting, "Francesco, Francesco, Papa Francesco." And he said, "No, no, Jesus. Chant Jesus, Jesus." So I think the mission of Pope Francis is Jesus' mission. And the best description of Jesus' mission comes from his first really public appearance in his hometown synagogue in Nazareth, when he read the words of Isaiah, "I come to bring, Spirit of God has anointed me, he has sent me to bring good news to the poor, liberty to captives, new sight to the blind, and to set the downtrodden free." That was Jesus' mission on earth. I think that is Pope Francis' mission, and I also think that's our mission today. You can see the logo for the trip. Love is our mission. The good news is this mission is not new. It doesn't come with Pope Francis or the Second Vatican Council. This is as old as the Scriptures, as powerful as the prophets, as clear as Matthew 25. And people make a big deal of trying to separate Pope Francis from his predecessors. That's not right, and it's not good. Each in their own way, each with their own gifts, each in their own context, have stood up for human life and dignity. Think of now St. John the 23rd, Pacem in Terris. John Paul II literally changed the world by standing with workers in Poland. Benedict is, I think, terribly underestimated as a teacher of the social doctrine of the Church. 2 of his 3 encyclicals were powerful pieces on the social teaching of the Church. And now we have both the words but also the ways of Pope Francis. So it's not new. The context is really complicated that he's walking into. We're a very vibrant, powerful, in some ways affluent, sophisticated, so many positive things. You think about the work of the church around the country, just think about the work of this school and this abbey. But we got lots of challenges within the church. Not enough people go to church. We have the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, not N-U-N-S, disaffiliation. We have a Hispanic challenge in that more and more of our people are Hispanic and our leaders are not. Lots of people are Catholic in name only. We're still dealing with some of the challenges of sexual abuse. We're a divided economy. You can talk about the gaps. For me, the fundamental indictment is not the gap, but how many people are stuck at the bottom. We're polarized. We're polarized politically, ideologically, economically. After what happened in South Carolina, it's all too clear there is a culture of violence amongst us. We still have 1 million abortions a year. We now have advocacy in many parts of the country for assisted suicide. People in South Carolina are calling for the death penalty so that we can teach that killing is wrong by killing the people, killing the person who killed people who were praying. This is a broken world. This is a bloody world. Imagine if we were having this meeting in Iraq. We just couldn't do it. First of all, many people have been just forced out of Iraq, many Christians. If we were having this meeting in Beijing to talk about how the church was going to talk to government, how we could shape our policy, someone would go to jail. I would hope it'd be the abbot or Chris or anyone but me. But people are literally giving their lives for what we are doing today. And we have what I call a demoralized politics in every sense of that word. And I think that's what Pope Francis is walking in. It's demoralized in that they can't get anything done. We're at war against ISIS, and the Congress hasn't even debated it, much less decided it. I think in many ways they've lost their way morally, and we can talk about that in terms of we should be about the common good, we should be about protecting the weak, the vulnerable, and mostly our politics are responding to the rich and powerful. This will bother some people, but I think what is at work here is too much of two different kinds of excessive individualism. For some on the right, it's a kind of economic individualism where the market itself is the measure of everything. And on the left, it's what I would call lifestyle individualism where choice, personal choice, is the measure of everything. And neither of those leave much room for the common good, for the poor, for the vulnerable. In Washington, you can't talk about anything without a poll. This is part of the problem with our politics. But it's worth just taking a look at the moment. When Pope Francis comes to Washington, he will come with these poll ratings. This is less than a week old. His favorable, unfavorable is 86-4. That's among Catholics. Catholics believes he's making a major change in direction, and 69% say it's for the good, 3% say no. Among all Americans, only 10% have an unfavorable impression of the Pope at a time when big institutions, when religious institutions are in great disfavor. Compare that. President Obama's unfavorable is 51%. Congress's favorable is 17%. Those must be their relatives. I mean, given the record. Hillary Clinton, more unfavorable than favorable. Same for Jeb Bush. Marco Rubio, who most of us are just getting to know, only 34% favorable. So the Pope goes in to this setting with a level of popularity that is unprecedented. Why is that? This is from the St. Poll. Why do people think so highly of him? 79% said it's because he addresses the needs of the poor. That's not what Washington is about these days. 84% because he's sharing our faith. 79% because he's addressing the needs of families. He's improving relations among religions, standing up for traditional values, 4 out of 5. A little lower on the Vatican bureaucracy. That will be his first miracle, I think, if it happens. And then relatively high numbers on the concerns of women and sex abuse and environment. Look at the last part of this chart. What describes Pope Francis? Compassionate, 94%. Humble, 91%. Open-minded, those are all the pluses. So one of the lessons is if you want what Pope Francis has, be like Pope Francis. Be compassionate. Be committed. Be principled. Defend the weak. A lot of discussion apparently yesterday about how things are going. 1 out of 5 Catholics thinks too liberal. 80% of us think we're doing the right shape. And the differences among Catholics who go to church and don't, among liberals, among conservatives, among Democrats and Republicans are minor. The one person, apparently, in public life who unites people is Pope Francis. Why is that? Well, he's authentic. He says authority is service. He doesn't lord it over people. I love the image where he was going to give a talk and said 24 hours the Vatican, St. Peter's was going to be open for confession. And he was going to go give a talk about that. And on the way in, he veers off and goes to confession. Imagine you're the priest. No warning. Wonder what the penance was. On the night he was elected, he said to the bishops, "May the Lord forgive you for what you've done." In the America article, I work for America, who is Bergoglio? I am a sinner. His opening line. I got up in the middle of the night when he went to Assisi thinking he would give a wonderful talk about the poor or creation or peace or all three. And I sat there with my yellow pad, and he walked into a room with more than 100 seriously disabled people with enormous challenge, young people mostly, but not always. And you know how this goes. The big shot walks in, he gives a speech, he says hello to a couple people and leaves. Pope Francis went from wheelchair to wheelchair to wheelchair, touching everybody, caressing their face, talking to them even though he couldn't, comforting their parents. It went on for an hour and a half, and I could not turn my eyes away from that image. That's why. His words are powerful, the joy of the gospel. If you don't have the Pope app, get it. I am not spiritually sophisticated or deep because of the time difference. I get up every morning, I hit the Pope app, and Monday through Friday I have the homily of the Holy Father from the Mass that day. It's usually about 4 or 5 paragraphs long. He says, God loves you, I love you, you're a good person, you can do better. Exactly what I need to hear. We've had a whole series of wonderful panels with very sophisticated people. My daughter has come to most of them. And I said, what is the thing that most stuck in your mind? And she said, the person who said the reason why Pope Francis is so admired is because he talks and walks like Jesus. He's a walking, talking parable. He is a happy, holy priest. He is the world's pastor. That's why he brings so much with him when he comes to America. And what will his message be? Well, it'll be what he says, but it will also be where he goes. Nothing's final with this trip, and I think a couple people here may be involved in this. I can only imagine what that must be like. But as of now, he is going to go from the Congress of the United States to serving the homeless in the streets of Washington. That will be more powerful than what he says on the Hill, who he spends his time on, and who he represents. This is not a lobbyist seeking special favors. This is someone speaking for the poor, the vulnerable. And what does he bring with him? The joy of the gospel. Cardinal O'Malley last night quoted these lines. The joy of the gospel fills the hearts and lives of all who encounter Jesus. With Christ, joy is constantly born again. The joy of the gospel. At a time of fear and judgment, he talks about joy and mercy. Now, he does so in very direct ways. There are Christians whose lives seem like Lent without Easter. No time for sourpusses. What is the Latin for sourpusses? Or Italian? Melancholy Christians. I think there are 2 kinds of leadership. If you think we've lost, if you think our values, the defense of life, of family, of justice and peace, if you think the culture is against us, then the temptation is to hunker down and preserve and protect what we have. If you think we're right, if you think we have what the world needs, then our task is to engage and persuade. Pope Francis is about engagement and persuasion. Cardinal O'Malley is about engagement and persuasion. This school is about engagement and persuasion. Mark Shields has a wonderful line. He talks about political parties, but it's really true, and it starts with churches. He says you can tell the health of an organization by whether they're looking for heretics or converts. Pope Francis is looking for converts. We ought to be engaging, persuading, converting. And the second major theme is the mercy of God. A year of mercy. This was said not as sophisticated way, but it really rings true for me. Very early, he said, "A little mercy makes the world less cold and more just." We need to understand this mercy of God, this merciful Father who has so much patience. God never, ever gets tired of forgiving us. In a world with so little joy and so little mercy, he brings that message with him. One of the things he brings, one of the challenges he offers, has nothing to do with politics or world affairs or ecclesial structures. He says, "I invite all Christians to a renewed personal encounter with Jesus Christ. Recent openness to letting him encounter them. No one should think this is not an invitation meant for him or her." So what he brings is an invitation to encounter Jesus. Not Papa Francesco, Jesus, as he told the crowd. And he warns us. He says, many of us want to encounter the Lord, each other, the poor, only on our terms, a small circle of friends. They want a purely spiritual Christ, without flesh and without the cross. They want interpersonal relationships mediated by screens and systems, which can be turned on and off. Sound familiar? I turned mine off before I got. God wants us to have a face-to-face encounter. God wants us to be personally involved, so we hear and know each other's pains and pleas, their joy. A lot of us are really busy. One of the things he said is no one can say that they cannot be close to the poor because their lifestyle demands more attention to other areas. This is an excuse commonly heard in academic, business, professional, and even ecclesial circles. I will not ask for a show of hands for the academics, the ecclesial, the business, the professional. None of us can think we are exempt from concern for the poor and for social justice. He also brings a clarity about mission, identity, and integrity. In the first homily he gave in the Sistine Chapel, he said, "We can do many things, but if we do not confess Jesus Christ, nothing will avail. We will become a compassionate NGO, but not the church." Here's my summary of this overall message of who he is and what he brings. He looks at the world, he looks at the economy, he looks at the environment, he looks at the United States from the bottom up. This is a pastor who, when he had time off, did not go to the opera, did not go to a football game. He went to the slums. And the world looks different from the slums than it does from this room. He looks at decision-making from the outside in. He focuses on the least, and then the rest of us, and then the most of us. He said we should not be obsessed with particular issues, and he mentioned abortion and contraception and marriage. But he offers no retreat at all. He puts them in a larger context. He calls for encounter, engagement. A Man of Mercy and Joy talks a lot about the devil and evil. So what I think we have is, in many ways, the same teaching with a new perspective, in some ways a new urgency, in some ways a new emphasis, in some ways a new priority, but it is the same gospel. What are his priorities? I think he will talk about human life and dignity, the priority for the poor, solidarity, freedom, family, immigration, pursuit of peace, care for creation. He will walk into politics saying politics is a worthy vocation. Each of us is called to participate in politics. He says, I want politicians, the Lord to give us politicians capable of sincere and effective dialogue. Does that sound like Washington to you? Grant us more politicians disturbed by the state of society, the lives of the poor. His metaphor is the throwaway culture. The young people are thrown away, the unborn are thrown away, the elderly, the victims of trafficking. We must say no to this throwaway culture. And so he defends human life and dignity, beginning with the unborn. He says the measure of our society is how we treat the most vulnerable, the poor. He says that we have to look at the structural dimensions of poverty, going beyond a simple welfare mentality. I'm moving quickly. He deplores the globalization of indifference. He says solidarity may be a dirty word in some places, but it is our word. He goes at the very beginning of his time as Pope to Lampedusa and says, who cries for the immigrants, for the mothers and fathers who have been lost? He focuses on the family and talks about the need to protect the family from external forces, to protect the institutions that care for the family, to defend religious liberty. And on religious liberty, while I'm sure he will talk about our challenges here, and they are significant, he will say especially that we cannot turn the other way, as he says, from people who are giving their very lives for our faith. He calls for a ministry of peace and reconciliation and dialogue. On the environment, I will just offer a couple things and then conclude. The PowerPoint has a number of quotes. I've sent the PowerPoint to the leaders of the conference, and you can have it. But the first thing I would say is this is not trendy. I was on All Things Considered, and I said, this is not trendy, it's traditional. And she said, well, it really sounds trendy. And I said, well, how many encyclicals have you covered? This began with Genesis, not Earth Day. And St. Francis was ours before he was the environmentalist. So this is about old ideas: prudence, modesty, humility, common good, care for the weak. As I said, what kind of world will we leave for our children? He offers a religious vision and a moral framework in an area that has been a contest of powerful interest. So he offers an ethical criteria and different questions to call to dialogue and common action. He offers words of warning, but also words of hope. This is very Catholic, very Francis. Let me conclude by saying he will say something in particular to lay men and women in the United States. He believes that this is our task to take the teaching. He has a wonderful quote, and it's in there, that says the temptation is to make the laity sacrosancts. It's great that we're electors. I'm an extraordinary minister. It's one great privilege. But that is not my vocation. My vocation is to be salt, light, and leaven. And that's what we need to bring to the world. That's what this school is about. That's what our initiative is about. So we need to bring the salt, the light, the leaven to public affairs. And when Pope Francis stands before the House and Senate to defend the unborn, to defend poor children, to defend the undocumented, we need to stand with him. When he stands in the capital of the United States and calls for care for creation, for the pursuit of peace, for a more just global economy, we need to stand with him. When he stands there and talks about the family and the vulnerable and a priority for the poor, we need to stand with him. This school, this conference, our work is an effort to prepare lay people for their true vocation, which is to take the values of our faith and bring them into the world, to build God's kingdom on earth. Lots of people want to be a part of Pope Francis' visit to the United States. Only a few of us will get to be there to see him, even fewer to touch him. Every one of us can participate in the journey of Pope Francis to the United States by walking with him. If you want to welcome Pope Francis to the United States, do what Francis does. Encounter the poor. Stand up for human life and dignity. Care for creation. And most of all, proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ. Thank you very much.
If you have a question, just raise your hand and wait for a microphone to get to you, then you can ask your question. Oh, yeah, up front.
Thank you. There were two phrases. I wonder if you could expand upon it, and expand upon it in a particular way. One of them was who wrote these notes? Oh. Structural poverty must be reformed, and we need a more just global economy. And in particular, I'd like to know your thoughts on what Francis sees the role of government in those two. What do those two processes entail, and what would be the role of government? Thank you.
I think the Church's teaching offers a variety of principles which are very much a part of who Francis is and where he comes from. And that's the dignity of the human person, the priority for the poor, the virtue of solidarity, and the practice of subsidiarity. He would say, I think, a couple things, has said, and that is we measure our life together by how the poor and vulnerable are doing. And frankly, that's not the way the Senate Finance Committee does it. Probably the best image I have is one that the U.S. bishops have used. If you think about the economy, in particular, think about efforts to overcome poverty. And this is where we had a summit of Catholic leaders and evangelical leaders that went from Opus Dei to the nuns on the bus, from Focus on the Family to Sojourners. Think of it as a table with four legs. It's sort of a clunky analogy, but I think it works. The first leg of the table is what individuals and families ought to do. Sacrifice for your kids, make wise choices, get an education. A second leg of that table is what community groups, what faith groups, what churches ought to do, which is to help families with those choices, to work against injustice and prejudice and violence. The third leg of that table is what the market needs to do. One of the things that is absolutely at the center of Pope Francis' leadership is work. In the middle of an encyclical about all this poetry and wonderful things, he says, don't forget about work and workers. And he thinks young people without work is one of the most horrible challenges we face. So the market needs to provide work where you can make a living, support a family, and have the benefits that allow you to live a decent life. And then the fourth leg of that table is what government ought to do. To level the playing field, to resist injustice, to create an economy where people can flourish, to regulate. People talk a lot about Pope John Paul II and his embrace of the market, and he did. He also said it needs to operate within a moral framework. The problem with Washington, in my experience, is everybody falls in love with one leg of the table. So it's all individual responsibility, it's all faith-based groups, the market will solve our problems, or government is the answer. That is not going to be Pope Francis' message, and that is not the Church's message. The most important thing he will say is, among all the things you are responsible for, this has to be at the top. One of the top things. When he went to the Philippines, when he went to Brazil, we can see what he said. He said to the leaders, you need to provide a just society, a fair economy, work for those who can work, and help for those who cannot. And that will be a message we don't hear very often in Washington. There's a couple back there.
Thank you. Could you speak a little bit about, right over here, your perspective on Francis on divorce and marriage? I know that there's a meeting coming up in the fall, and maybe you could say a few words about that. Thank you.
This is one where I'm outside my expertise and topic. The one thing, I don't know, is Ross here? He said he had to go back, but I'm not as pessimistic or as conflicted by this. I have lots of confidence that the leaders of the Church and Pope Francis will find a way to keep faith with our tradition, but also to respond with compassion and mercy. I'll give you a very practical example, and it's not an answer. You have a family, a bunch of kids, and the dad runs off with his secretary. It's awful. I don't think he ought to go to communion. I mean, he needs to change his life. He needs to get things right. He leaves behind a wife with a bunch of kids. She falls in love and finds someone who can help raise that family. Should she be denied the sacraments for the rest of her life? Now, maybe there's a way in the annulment process or something to get this fixed, but the way, I'll get in trouble with this. I think things look a little different from the slums of Argentina than they look from, suburban America. When you're trying to raise kids in the slums of Argentina, whether your papers are right is not the most important question. It's whether you're raising your kids with dignity, whether you love each other, whether you stay together, whether your faith is strong and you go to church. So part of this might be a difference in priorities. I'm sure there are other people on the program who can answer this better, but as a parent, as a husband, as a father, I think we have to find a way to maintain the message this society really needs, that love is not a toy, sex is not a toy, but also brings the measure of mercy to those who are trying to live with integrity. So that's why practicing theology without a license ought to be penalized, and I just did it. One more.
Is there one public policy issue over the next 2 years that you think will have a positive play based upon this visit? One national public policy issue. Pick any one you like but it has to be implemented within 2 years.
I actually have a decent answer to this. A month ago, we brought together 50 evangelical leaders, as I said, liberal, conservative, 50 Catholic leaders from across the spectrum, 50 of our friends and allies. President Obama agreed to come, not to give a speech, but to be a part of a discussion. We had a Republican senator, a Democratic senator, we had labor, we had business, we had pastors from Baltimore. We spent 3 days together. What was striking to me is that the people who were not Catholic had the greatest hopes for Pope Francis' visit. They think by who he is, what he stands for, what he will say, and what he does, he has the chance to end the silence on poverty and break the stalemate. And we're frankly working to make that possible. When we started the summit, one of our funders said, all right, we've read all the proposals, all the fancy language. What do you really want to accomplish? And I said, don't write this down. And of course they grabbed their pens and started writing. I said, we want to help the church be the church, to be a church of and for the poor, that Pope Francis talks about, both Catholic, evangelical, and broader. We want to help conservatives and Republicans move from new interests, new language on poverty to new action. And we want to help President Obama and the Democrats find their voice and to make this a priority for the next 2 years and beyond. In particular, we want to try and end the wall, break down the wall between those who mostly focus on family factors as causes and remedies for poverty and those who focus mostly on economic factors. Because anybody who is poor, works with the poor, knows that a child's future is determined by the choices of her parents and by the policies of her government and the workings of her economy. It is time, and I have some hopes, that we can move beyond the polarization, the partisanship, and the neglect, frankly. And the Pope Francis' one message will be, when you pledge liberty and justice for all, become a nation of liberty and justice for all. Thank you very much.